Hello, everyone, and good evening, and welcome back to Bible Basics with Pastor Steve. Good to have you all here tonight. Please say hi in the comments. Let us know that you're here. Let us know where you're watching from. If you're willing to share that information, you don't have to. Just gives us a little bit of a sense of community here. And tonight we are going to be talking about Elijah and Ahab yet again. Good evening, Mike and Kim are here from Frederick. And Rob Vargo and Jean are here from St. The Vargos and Jean are here from St. Mary's County. Welcome, guys. Tonight, Elijah and Ahab, part 3, moving on. And this will be the last of Elijah and Ahab because it'll be the last of Ahab. And then we're going to move into, there's still a little bit more of Elijah that we'll cover after that. We're doing a survey of the Bible. Each week we're doing one critical Bible story. I'm trying to hit all the most. Oh, thank you. I'll say a word about this shirt in a minute. Trying to hit all the stories that I really feel like people should know from the Bible. I know that not everybody reads the Bible on a regular basis. And many of the stories that are referenced in classic literature and referenced in church and in sermons are stories that people aren't always familiar with anymore. So I want to be sure that everybody is familiar with all of the most important stories that people should know. They're really the key stories that shape our faith. And I'm sending out to the email address that is on your screen each week a retelling of the story in casual modern English. It's close enough that you can recognize the biblical language in it, but it is my own paraphrasing. If you have any questions, you can also send those to me at that same email address, or you can put the questions in the comments. So, good evening, Charles. So, a few years back, I've been wearing Hawaiian shirts during the warmer months for many, many years now. And the warmer months, of course, are most of the year now as the climate has changed, unfortunately. So I reached the point where I said, I need some Halloween Hawaiian shirts. And I went on to Amazon, and it did not disappoint me. It is hard to find them in American sizing, though. So anyway, so this shirt is, of course, imported, as most of the things on Amazon are. And the interesting thing about it, as you will see, it has on it slices of orange, in addition to normal black and orange things like cats and spider webs and bats and pumpkins and everything. There's oranges, and there's orange cocktails and all kinds of interesting things on there. And of course, the color orange is associated with Halloween, but as far as I know, the fruit, the orange, never has been. And my theory is that this wasn't just manufactured in a place where English is not the dominant language, but it was actually designed in a place that doesn't celebrate Halloween. And perhaps the distinction between orange the color and orange the fruit was not so clear. So I don't care. I love it. Somebody said to me today, well, maybe they're not slices of orange. Maybe they're slices of lemon, but that would make even less sense. Anyway, so thank you for liking this shirt. I like the shirt too. Makes me happy. I'm full of whimsy. Let's go ahead and start with a word of prayer, shall we? Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, for you alone are our rock and our redeemer. Amen. So I know we mentioned before that Ahab, the name Ahab is known to many people today, not because he's a biblical king, but because he was also the captain in Moby Dick, named after the biblical king. And in Moby Dick, it references the fact that the captain was named after a person, and the event was mentioned that happens in this story that we hear today. So we're looking at 1 Kings chapters 21 and 22. That's where I got the details from. So there was a man named Naboth who owned a vineyard. It was in Jezreel, near King Ahab's palace. Ahab went to him and said, I want your vineyard so I can convert it into a vegetable garden. I'll give you a better vineyard in exchange, or I'll pay you a fair price. And Naboth replied, God forbid. This vineyard has been in my family for generations. Ahab went home and sulked in his room. He wouldn't even get out of bed to eat. Queen Jezebel asked him why he was so upset, and he told her, and she said, cheer up. Aren't you the king? I'll get your vineyard for you. And Jezebel wrote letters to the elders of Jezreel. She told them to find 2 false witnesses to accuse Naboth of cursing God and king. She signed Ahab's name to the letters and used the royal seal. The elders did as they were told, and Naboth was stoned to death. When Jezebel received confirmation, she told Ahab to go take possession of the vineyard. The Lord told Elijah what they had done and sent him to meet Ahab at the vineyard. When Ahab arrived, he saw Elijah and said, "You again, old enemy?" Elijah said, "Yes, it's me. You've sold your soul to evil, and you've led the nation to sin. The Lord says the dogs will lick up your blood in the same place where Naboth was killed, and they will eat your wife." Ahab tore his clothes and put ashes on his head. Several years later, Jehoshaphat, I always stumble over his name, Jehoshaphat, Chubb and Jehoshaphat, right? Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, and Ahab, the king of Israel, went to war with the Arameans in an attempt to reclaim Ramoth Gilead from Syria. Ahab wore plain armor instead of royal clothes, so no one would recognize him in battle. The king of Syria ordered his men to avoid engaging anyone except the king. When they saw Jehoshaphat in his robes, they assumed he was the king of Israel and chased after him. But when they realized he was the king of Judah, they broke off the chase. Meanwhile, a rogue arrow fired randomly by an archer caught Ahab right between the armor plates. Ahab turned to his driver and said, "I'm hit. Get me out of here." They withdrew, and Ahab propped himself up in his chariot so he could watch the battle from a distance. He bled out into the chariot while he sat there. When word reached the camp that the king had died, the army withdrew, and they buried him. Ahab's chariot was full of blood, so they washed it out in the pool of Samaria. Dogs drank the bloody water, and prostitutes bathed in it. Wow. What a note to end on, but that is indeed where the story ends. Hello, Cindy. Good to have you here. Hello, Barbara. Good to have you here. And hello, John. So, reflections on this story. You think it's great? You think that was grisly? Wait till Jezebel dies. Yeah, she won't for a little while still. So there's really 2 stories here. I wanted to include them both because obviously the conclusion of the second story fulfills the prophecy of the first story, right? So regarding Naboth's vineyard, you may remember that during the tribal federation years, which we studied not too long ago, before the kings, land was allotted to the tribes, and the tribes distributed the land to the families within the tribes. And every so many years, there was a jubilee year where they would reshuffle the land based on how many people were in each family and each clan, and debts were erased and so forth. And any land that had been mortgaged went back to its original owner, which of course could then be redistributed. Oh, and the other Barbara's here too. Both Barbaras are here. Welcome. So now that we have kings, that system of land management is beginning to break down. It's coming to an end, basically, which, Samuel warned that things like this were going to happen. If you have a king, the king's going to take stuff from you. And that is exactly what is happening now. And if the king takes land, it's permanent. It's not going to get reshuffled with the Jubilee year. In fact, we don't even know that the Jubilee year happened after the kings after Israel became a monarchy. The tribes are gradually losing control. Well, they're losing control over their land. I don't know how gradual it was, but they're losing control. So Israel's kings, of course, are supposed to be different from other kings, right? That's what God said when he it's not exactly what God said. The people said, "We want kings like other nations have." And then they had Saul, who was a king like other nations, and Saul was rejected by God. Then God gave David, who was a different king, a different kind of a king, the model for what a king should be like. Well, Ahab is not that, right? Ahab is the kind of king that other nations have, which is, where Jezebel comes in, because Jezebel's not an Israelite. She expects him to act like her dad, like other kings she's known. And in those kings, you don't say no to the king. If the king says, I want your vineyard, you don't get to say no, I'm not going to sell it to you. That's how she wants Ahab to act. And a final word on that: vineyards are long-term investments. It takes a vineyard a long time to mature, and then it takes the wine in the vineyard time to ferment and then to age properly. I don't know how much aging wine got back in those days. I think it probably didn't get much, but the point is, it takes a lot of time and energy to grow a vineyard, and to convert one into a vegetable garden. It's absolutely foolish. It destroys the value of the land. Why would you do that? And so it shows that Ahab is not just an unfaithful king and an unethical king, but he's also a foolish king. So then there's this war with Syria, and it's a short-lived war. It doesn't last long. The city, they're trying to regain Rabbith Gilead. What's the name? I mispronounced the name. Hang on. They're trying to retake Ramoth Gilead, which was an Israelite city. It was part of the tribal land allotment. So it is rightfully Israel's. Syria, it wasn't Syria as we know it today, but it was the same area. Hello, Stella. The Syrians have taken the city and moved the border, and obviously Israel wants to move the border back and retake the city. And at this point in the story, Israel and Judah are allies, so they're going to do this together. They're sort of sister nations. So Ahab's cause was in the right. The problem isn't that he's fighting an unjust war. The problem is that God's not going to help Ahab, because Ahab is a bad king. And as far as we know, Ahab did not ask for any divine guidance on whether or not this war should take place. Now, we didn't hear the story of the end of Jezebel yet. At the end of this, that's not going to happen until the next book we get into, which will be Second Kings. And originally, it was one long book. I'm not sure. It was broken into two books for practical reasons that probably had a lot more to do with bookbinding technology than it had to do with anything else. Of course, because in Judaism, it's a single scroll, but printing press. All right. So, what does this story tell us about God? Well, we noted last week that God is active in these stories, right? We've read a lot of stories where God's not particularly active, where God isn't even named. God is active in these stories. And yet again, this week, that is still the case. God speaks to Elijah, and God passes judgment on Ahab. Now, he doesn't smite Ahab with a bolt of lightning or anything like that. Ahab dies in battle. So the question is, did God decide that Ahab was going to die in battle? Maybe. It doesn't say that explicitly. It does say that God knows that it's going to happen. So is God just informing Ahab through Elijah that this is going to happen to him in battle, and that it's because he's been a bad king? Or is God saying to Ahab through Elijah, I have decided that you will die in battle? We don't know. Is God working through the Syrians, or is Ahab just getting his just desserts, and because he's made bad decisions, this is just how things play out when you make bad decisions? We don't know. It could be either. God operates both ways, and ultimately it might not matter, because the important thing is that God is saying something about this. He's saying that when you die in battle, it's going to be just, because you have this coming. Okay, so whether God is making it happen or not isn't as important as what all of it says about Ahab in the eyes of God. So what does this story tell us about ourselves? Well, Ahab is a grown man who pouts like a child. Doesn't get what he wants, goes home, goes to his room, flops down in his bed, won't come out for dinner. Like an adolescent boy. Of course, he's not alone in that. A lot of grown men act like adolescent boys, and some grown women too. I was in the parking lot at Best Buy yesterday. I came out of the I came out of the store into the parking lot, and I heard a ruckus. I looked around to see where the ruckus was coming from, and there was a young woman sitting in her car on her phone. Nobody was in danger. That was all I really cared about. It was just one, it sounded like an altercation was taking place, but it was just a woman on her phone, and young woman, and she was screaming into this phone as loud as she could, high pitched, full voice, gonna hurt, screaming into this phone in this argument. And of course, the volume doesn't go through the phones, right? The phone's not going to match the volume. On the other hand, and on the other end, in fact, they're designed not to do that. I'm like, wow, this is a grown up screaming like a child would scream in an argument. I don't know that any of my children ever did scream that loud in an argument. It was something else. So I mean, this happens. Men and women alike don't always grow up. I don't pretend to know why that happens. I don't understand why that happens. Because the temptation, of course, is to say, well, Ahab was born into power and wealth. He was raised, so he's got to be spoiled. And he's in the half of the kingdom that's in rebellion already. So but that doesn't. There are kings that are raised in the same situation who come out fine. Kings don't all come out like Ahab, and I know plenty of people who are not kings. They're at the other end of the socioeconomic scale who come out fine, but also some who come out very much like this. We're just a mess as a human being. So I don't know that we're going to blame it on his station or on his parents, although they certainly could have had something to do with it. What does this story then tell us about our relationship with God and each other? I know some people read the Bible and they say that the Old Testament shows a God of judgment, the New Testament shows a God of grace. And that is not true. God is gracious all the way through. So how do we reconcile that with the God who says, if God is gracious, then why is God saying, okay, well, the dogs are going to lick your blood? Well, see, here's the thing. Whether or not God is being gracious depends on who you ask, right? Because is God going to be gracious with Ahab, even if it means people like Naboth are going to suffer? How many more Naboths do there have to be before God says that's enough grace, no more? Or was one Naboth enough? And God's going to say, okay, you've shown that you can't be trusted with this power, so your time is going to have to come to an end. See, God is being gracious to everyone else when Ahab has his end. If we're, if we are damaging God's creation, if we're hurting God's children, I don't think that we should expect God's grace to extend to letting us continue to abuse God's children. Something, God is going to intervene sooner or later. This is shown over, throughout history. If we've learned anything in history, God does not let justice go on indefinitely. Sooner or later, he lets it. It goes on longer than we want it to, often because we don't cooperate when God wants to put an end to it, but it doesn't go on forever. So that's what we learned this week. And next week we'll talk more about Elijah, and we'll talk about Elijah passing the torch to Elisha, I believe, next week. So I found the news item that was somewhat interesting tonight in the world of Methodism. They've done more studies about the fallout from the disaffiliations and discovered that, and this is the Lewis Center, which is based out of Wesley Seminary, named after President Lewis, former president of the seminary, president while I was there. And they have discovered that the disaffiliations have changed the age demographics of the clergy in the United Methodist Church. Most of the clergy who left were either over 55 or under 35. the 35 to 55s, which would be the the late millennials and the early Generation X and late millennials. That wait, am I saying that right? No, late Generation X and early millennials. They are not represented much in the people that left. And I wonder if that's because there aren't as many of us to start with. And I could be wrong about that. I'd love to know what portion of Methodist clergy are my generation. I don't really have a good feel for that. Most of the people that I look at and think, oh, they're my age. They're actually younger than me. And a lot of people who are older than me look at me and think I'm part of their generation, when in fact I'm not. I don't have a good feel for these things. Um, so, and if there are a lot of us my age in the denomination, why didn't as many of us leave? Is that a function of our theology? Is it that there just weren't that many of us who wanted to leave? Or is it that there were in fact people of my generation who would have left, but they didn't because of the stage their life they're at right now? They felt like they couldn't. So I know retired people who left the denomination, so it doesn't affect them at all. Their pensions in place, their 401k is in place, and you could also see how younger people who wanted to leave might have thought, well, starting over at this point isn't that big a deal. I haven't gotten very far yet. Whereas the people who are sort of in the middle, they've got a pretty heavy stake in this. So as much as I'd like to say it was a matter of our theology being more moderate, that might not have been the case. We might have some very disgruntled, very conservative clergy of Generation X who hung out not because they wanted to, but because they felt that they had to. So the percentage of clergy who are under 35 has continued to drop, has been dropping since the early 80s. And that is part of why the average age of the person in the pews has risen, because, and it shouldn't be much of a surprise, people relate best to pastors who are of their own generation. So pastors get the best responses from people who are within a 10 years, give or take, from their own age. So for me, that will be 45 to 65, 44 to 64. Those are going to be the people that relate to me the best because their life experiences have been similar to mine. So that means people below the age of 44 are going to be looking for a pastor below the age of 44. Unless, of course, you have those rare individuals who just are able to relate to people at any age. So the article I read, which is on UM Insight, if you want to look at it, it looked at which conferences had the largest number of young clergy, because we assume that that's good to have young clergy, right? And our conference is not in the top 10. Yeah. So ever since, in this conference at least, ever since the 80s, we have attracted mostly midlife people in the candidacy process. So it's not that we're not attracting new people into ministry, and by attracting I mean people hearing the call, which is both a function of the individuals and the congregations that raise them. We don't have that many young people in those congregations hearing the call into ministry, partly because we don't have that many young people in the pews, but we have people at other ages in the pews. So people are coming into ministry. We get new ministers every year, but most of them are not young. Most of them are more midlife aged. That's been the case since the 80s. And I remember when I came through and I declared candidacy around 1990, and there were very few people on the district committee on ministry that I went before. Very few of them had begun their careers at the age that I was at. Most of them had entered their career, heard their calling as middle-aged people. And generally speaking, they were very skeptical that a young person could have a valid call in ministry. They were almost openly hostile to it. They would, I'll never forget, 20 years prior, of course, it would have been normal for a 20-year-old to be sitting before the district committee on ministry, and they would have been overjoyed to have it. But the group that I was before at that time, I get questions like, well, is your dad a minister? No, my dad's a computer programmer. Well, then where is this coming from? Well, it's coming from God. It's supposed to come from God. It's not the call. It's not supposed to come from my dad. It's funny now, but it wasn't funny at the time. I remember one person closed every meeting saying, "Steve, my son's your age, and he has no idea what he wants to do with his life." And what I wanted to so bad to say was, "Well, I'm not your son. And besides, when we're talking about calling, it's not about what we want to do with our lives. It's about what God has asked us to do with our lives." Anyway, we're doing a better job, from my perspective, as a middle-aged person dealing with younger people coming into ministry. I like to think that we're treating them better than we were treated when we came through. But of course, we always make that assumption, don't we? We always think, oh, well, when I have kids, I'm not going to treat them the way my parents treated me. But then we find out that maybe our parents weren't so crazy when we get there. Anyway, I do think that we do a better job with the young folk. We just don't have as many of them. And the thing is, most of the young folk entering ministry now, they did not hear their calling to the ministry in their congregation. They were in a congregation, but they heard their calling at camp, summer camp, Methodist summer camp. And that is one of the reasons, I believe, why this conference has continued to invest heavily in our summer camp programming, whereas most conferences are trying to sell their camps now. It's way too valuable from a long-term perspective. We need to sow seeds for the future. I mean, we can continue to just keep nabbing people at middle-aged indefinitely. There's always going to be middle-aged people to grab, but geez, it'd be nice if we had people in the pulpit that could relate to the younger folks, so that the younger folk, I believe the gospel actually works. I think you can get through young adulthood more joyfully if you do it with the gospel than without. At any rate, next week we will talk about the end of Jezebel. Don't forget to email me any questions you've got. This week in church, most of you know that every year around October, at some point in October, almost every year, I preach a sermon that has sort of a monster theme to it, something that's sort of a Halloween themed sermon, because there's so many theological topics that you can find in stuff like this, and so many ways you can talk about God and about human nature in particular. This year is going to be more about human nature probably than about God, but certainly the way religion has handled that human nature over the years. I'm not going to tell you which one it is now, although the promotional graphic will probably get posted sometime tomorrow or the day after. I just got to get it together first. So watch for that. Gonna have fun in church on Sunday. At least I'll have fun. I hope y'all have fun too. So if I don't see you in church on Sunday, I will see you sometime online. Let's go ahead and close with a serenity prayer, shall we? Gracious God, give me the grace to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed, the courage to change the things which should be changed, and the wisdom to distinguish the one from the other. Amen. Thanks for joining tonight, everyone.